I'm no tech genius, but I knew if I wanted my business to crush it, I needed a website now. Thankfully, Bluehost made it easy. I customized, optimized, and monetized everything exactly how I wanted with AI. In minutes, my site was up. I couldn't believe it. The search engine tools even helped me get more site visitors. Whatever your passion project is, you can set it up with Bluehost. With their 30-day money-back guarantee, what do you got to lose? Head to Bluehost.com. That's BLUEHOST.com to start now.
Hi, I'm Mike Pesca, host of The Gist, and I'm the kind of person, maybe you are too, who likes to step outside the easy reinforcement of my own ideas. Maybe you actually like to have your beliefs tested and your perspectives expanded. I find that exciting, not unsettling. There are a lot of shows, ideologically driven shows and networks whose audiences say, "Thank you for telling me I'm not crazy." But I don't really doubt my own sanity. I don't need affirmation and reassurance that my side or one side of the political or social debate is right. I'm more worried about being misinformed by lazily going along with the untested assumption or narrative. The Gist is for people who know that being interesting starts with being interested. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi everyone, Patrick here, cutting in before our new interview episode in order to discuss, or to give a little bit of background, I should say, on the author that I'm talking to today. So I'm here to talk to Tom Fraser, who recently published a book called Invested in Crisis: Public Sector Pensions Against the Future, which is a really interesting book, and I, as I mentioned in the episode, highly recommend that people check it out. A bit on Tom: he is a union researcher based in Toronto. He has an academic background in labor history, and he is currently interested on researching Ontario's long-term care sector and more broadly on de-industrial political economy, much like Canada is facing today. And he has written on a wide range of topics like labor, pensions, or infrastructure policy, which all play a part in the book that we discussed today. And his writings have appeared in such publications as the Globe and Mail, as well as Canadian Dimension. So you can check out his writings elsewhere, but I just want to give a bit of background on him, and without further ado, let's get right into the episode.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
I'm here today with Tom Fraser, and we're here to talk about your latest book, Invested in Crisis: Public Sector Pensions Against the Future, which right off the bat is a really intriguing title. When I saw it, I was like, ooh, what does this mean? So I think the easiest question that we can actually start off with is, what exactly is this book about for someone who might not have actually heard of it?
So the book is about one key driving question. How did it come to be that Ontario pension funds came to be the owners of everything? And now that, of course, inspires all sorts of follow-up questions.
Mm-hmm.
What is a pension fund? What do they own? What constitutes everything? There are myriad questions to those who aren't either attuned to the world of finance, in which pension funds are a huge deal, to the world of critical political economy, where people are talking about real estate, infrastructure, the sinews of social necessity, or to the world of labor, in which people are thinking about workers and the welfare supports that they have fought for over the course of centuries. So when I answered the question, what is the book about, with a relatively esoteric response, that's probably not particularly useful. So what is the book about? The book takes as its topic the enormous retirement savings plans that exist to finance the retirements of workers in Ontario's public sector. Specifically, in the case of this book, the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System, or OMERS, I'll call it OMERS for the rest of the interview, and the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, which in the finance world is generally called just teachers, but I'm going to call it OTPP in order to differentiate when I'm talking about teachers, the plan, and teachers, the people, the occupation.
Right. Yeah.
And so basically, OMERS and teachers are enormous investment funds. Think of them similar to a private equity fund, an asset manager, that sort of thing. Except their members, their kind of financiers in a more kind of mundane sense, are public sector workers whose labor is kind of intimately connected to everyday life in the province of Ontario. In the case of teachers, it's literally teachers. In the case of OMERS, it's municipal staff, city parks, municipal nursing homes, that sort of thing. And they all take paycheck deductions every biweekly that go towards these enormous pension plans, which then invest those contributions in capital markets so as to pay out good retirement savings later on through what's called a defined benefit pension system. And maybe that's something we'll get to later, but that's a relatively technical sort of thing.
Mhm.
But the key of it for the book's purposes is that since the 1980s, these pension funds, not just OMERS and OTPP, but a bunch of others, what are often called in the financial sector the Maple Eight, the
Yeah.
big Canadian pension funds, have become enormous players. Huge, 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 internationally renowned players in institutional investment, which refers to like kind of big asset managers beyond the level of, me buying whatever stock on
Mhm. Small fry stuff.
whatever
Yeah.
stock app. I don't know what the stock apps are called, but you get where I'm going. And specifically, and this is what the book is at its core about, is that they have become particularly influential and powerful in investments in what are called alternatives. What does alternatives mean? Conventional finance, buying and selling, is largely public stocks, like the New York Stock Exchange, the Toronto Stock Exchange, whatever. You're buying one share, 10 shares, however many shares in a publicly traded company, or you're buying bonds, whether they're government or corporate, which basically means you're loaning money either to the government or to a corporation. You get it paid back at an interest rate. It's generally a safer investment than
Mhm.
stocks, generally lower return. The Canadian pension plans, and owners and teachers specifically, are big players in alternatives, which are things like real estate, things like infrastructure, things that actually have a deeply physical imprint in the world in which we live and are hyper related to how we live our lives in the world. And so the story the book seeks to tell, and I realize that I've gone in a very kind of wraparound, sort of labyrinthine way of answering the question. The story the book aims to tell is how it came to be that Ontario's workers' retirement savings came to own the apartment buildings we live in and the infrastructure we need to survive.
Mhm.
What were the economic and political processes that produced that? That's the overarching story. That is the crisis in question,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Which is really fascinating. You're holding up a book, and this is an audio medium, so maybe people can't see it because it's a really small book at the end of the day, right? It's like, if I remember correctly, about 250 pages or something like that. And yet you managed to weave in all of these elements in a really, really interesting way, right? And in a way that I think is a credit to you as a writer of actually managing to make it seem not too daunting to approach what you were saying can be perhaps a daunting subject, right? Because it involves literally everything, from politics to economy to our futures. So I just wanted to emphasize, yes, you had this long response, but at the end of the day, a pretty important and hefty book despite its size. So I just wanted to commend you on that. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add about that, about weaving all of that, but I just wanted to say good job on that.
That's very kind of you. Yeah, the brevity is largely a function of two things.
Right.
The first is that it came out of a master's thesis, and so
That was my next
there's
question.
a
Yeah.
sort there's a built-in brevity, different than books that come out of PhD
Mhm.
theses or otherwise. And the second is that I was always a bad academic insofar as the levels of hyper detail, getting caught down in seven layers of weeds, were just never particularly interesting to me
Mhm.
as a writer. Like I hated writing it. And
That's fair.
so when I began this project from the get-go, it was kind of conceptualized as this is meant to be more focused on the analysis than on the research,
Yeah.
as
Okay.
if that's kind of the easiest way to put it.
No, I think that makes sense. I'm curious because you mentioned, right, you kind of lead into the next question that I had of this idea for this book beginning as a graduate piece during your MA. And I'm curious how the idea evolved from that moment to the final product, right? Did your perspective shift? Did the actual scope shift? Like, what was the thought process from the initial point of inception all the way to what is now on bookshelf?
Yeah, so there was a longer genealogy to it. In I guess this would have been fall 2019. I accompanied a department research trip with the geography department at the University of Toronto to New York. And we went and we visited Hudson Yards, which people who read the book will find out that Hudson Yards is the very beginning. It's where it all starts. And it's where the intellectual journey started. Because we go to Hudson Yards on this trip, and the professor who we're there with tells us that it's owned by Omers, which immediately that clicks minor alarm bells because I was already at that point thinking about how labor fits into struggles over housing in the 21st century city,
Right.
right? So we get informed Omers owns this gargantuan, horrifying, like total cathedral to finance capital. And then we go across town, I believe the same day, but it might have been a different day. It was a week-long trip to a high-rise community on the Lower East Side, which for context, Hudson Yards is on the west side. Uh, and this other place, Peter Cooper Village, Stuyvesant Town, is on the Lower East Side, which is a former kind of hotbed of municipal socialism and real kind of radical experimentation in not just kind of urban form and public housing, but specifically labor unions taking a very active role in building non-market housing. And there's this high-rise community. And we were told that 10 years ago, and I guess that would be at this point 15 years ago, uh, the big Quebec pension plan, which is called the Caisse de dépôt et placement de Québec, or the CAS is what it's always called in the financial sector, went 50-50 buying this entire high-rise compound. It's like 20 buildings. There are like 10,000 people who live there.
Yeah.
They went 50-50 on this high-rise community with Blackstone, which people who are attuned to housing justice, Blackstone rings about 18,000 red flags because Blackstone was the biggest purchaser of foreclosed properties in the
Yeah.
US in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. So first we have on the west side, Ontario Pension Fund owns this $25 billion real estate project, the largest real estate project in the history of the US, which is crazy because the US is a country founded upon real estate.
Right.
Then on the other side, you have the Quebec Public Pension Plan. It's not even a worker pension plan, it's
Hmm.
everyone,
Yeah.
is going splitsies with the most evil institutional investor in the housing sector on this high-rise community. So obviously that drilled a hole in my brain, because how could it
Hmm.
not?
Yeah.
I'm already thinking about housing stuff. I'm already thinking about labor, and this is like totally, absolutely bonked. It remains in stasis for about 7 months.
Yeah.
Summer 2020, during kind of the height of the uh kind of Black Lives Matter, anti-police, like let's have this really detailed, robust conversation
Hmm.
about anti-Black racism, a lot of which, especially in the US, became oriented around why the hell are there cops in the labor movement?
Yeah.
And similar sorts of conversations with nuances related to the relationship between cops and the labor movement in
Hmm.
Canada. It then crossed my mind one day, huh, Ontario pension funds own a lot of crap. I wonder if they own or have shares in any prison P3s, public-private partnerships. Sorry, I jumped in with the acronym before using the whole term.
No, that's fine.
Uh, because prisons, like most major infrastructure projects, as discussed in the book, are
Hmm.
built through public-private partnerships. The government gives the contract to an institutional investor who does the building, owns the facility, rents to the government, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was curious as to if any of the Ontario pension funds owned any prison. The answer was no, by the way, which was a
Good.
nice thing to find out. But so that kind of kept it in the mind where it
Mhm.
maybe previously wouldn't have fully been, and also inspired me to kind of think more robustly, okay, what does it actually mean for a pension fund to be invested in something. And so that remained bouncing around my brain until I'm in this master's seminar in the fall of 2020. It's just a few months later on transnational history. So encouraging us to think not just about, connections between places, but kind of the more robust kind of intermeshing and et cetera, et cetera. And I discovered around that time, I forget exactly how, that owners of Hudson Yards, also owned a bunch of public schools in rural Nova Scotia, which is where I'm from. Well, I'm from Nova Scotia writ large. I'm not from
Yeah,
rural Nova
yeah,
Scotia. And something inside me was just like, what had to happen for a public school in a town of 500 people in rural Nova Scotia to have the same owner as the largest real estate project in the history of the United States?
hmm
What are the tentacles there? And who made
yeah,
the octopus, right?
hmm
And so what began as a fairly kind of macro level term paper on the political economic processes behind pension marketization. And again, it was fairly loose. There wasn't a ton of original research in it. It
sure,
was it was more conceptual and then linking in specific things in kind of pension history, as
yeah.
it were.
It's a term paper.
Um, then grew into my master's thesis because I realized about a week into the second term of my master's, I was like, why would I leave this? There's so much more to
This gold
expand.
mine. Yeah.
Yeah, like I remember being kind of midway through writing this paper, and in the apartment I was living in at the time, I had this nice kind of little office space, and I had this space right above it. And just, because this was the layout I had a New York Transit map on one wall and a Toronto Transit map on the other. And I started putting thumbtacks in the maps where miscellaneous Ontario pension investments were. And then I started anytime I had like a random idea related to how these things came together, a post-it note went on the wall until eventually I had like the whole, police tracking down the killer,
Right.
insane thumbtacks and threads sort of thing going on. And a friend at the time was like, yeah, like this is your life. Like you do pensions now. That's what you
Mhm.
do. And at
No
the
matter
time
what you do. Yeah.
and at the time I was in denial about it. And now here I am holding the book. So I guess she was right. Um and so I told my master's supervisor, I was nervous about this conversation. I was like, I'm gonna fully pivot to the pension project. And he
Mhm.
was like, you should have done that 2 months ago. And I was like, all right, well, clearly you're on board. And so that's kind of how it began to come together. And so a lot of what was in that original term paper, if it didn't explicitly like copy paste make it into here,
Sure.
continued to structure the whole thing. And it just became a matter of really getting into the archive, getting into the weeds, locating things more specifically in Ontario and in Canada really,
hmm
because most of the pension literature, which I was able to have access to at that point, keep in mind this is the height of COVID, uh, was in American literature, which through rhetorical sleight of hand, I was able to launder into a paper about Ontario pension funds,
Sure.
uh, but not to the level of robustness which would be required for a master's thesis, let alone a book.
Yeah.
Um, but it was really at that point that I started thinking about like the high level processes at play before getting into the nitty-gritty specifics of the archive. The broad sense of what forces are moving here was really began to be cultivated in that master's seminar before really then fully falling into place over the course of the subsequent year.
I really like your references to other provinces and the fact that this is likely, while you focus on Ontario in the book, right? It's likely a Canada-wide thing, right? And you mentioned Quebec investments. And as someone who does live in Quebec, I live in Montreal, as listeners may know, right? Like this is something that as I was reading, I inevitably thought about like, where does my pension fund go? Right? Like, where does it come from? And these are questions that we have to ask ourselves because they are valuable questions. And it's something, another thing that I was thinking of as I was reading through the book is the database that emerged. I want to say like a year and a half or 2 years ago. I don't know if you're aware of it. I think it's the Maple that runs it, that lets you know like which MPs have actual investments in housing, right? Which is a fascinating database to actually have publicly available to people, and people should definitely check it out. So I appreciate your book not only concentrating on Ontario, but opening up these doors to what I hope will be a wider national discussion on this issue. Because I think you are correct in saying that to this tentacular beast that it is, right? And we'll get into the more international aspects of it with other questions, but I think this is something that I want to emphasize to listeners as a crucial and really integral part of your project.
Yeah,
Um,
well, it's funny because like we're
yeah.
having this whole tariffs has reinvigorated this
Hmm.
conception of the national border as this kind of the nation state is the economic
Yeah.
unit, which like obviously not the case, right?
No.
Like finance moves across borders, it moves across oceans, uh, but not only does it move in the abstract via
Hmm.
computers, it plants itself into the built environment, which is a huge part of what I try and get at here. And so even if the funds are based on Bay Street in Toronto,
Hmm.
they are intimately connected to everyday life around the globe.
Yeah.
And in terms of it being a Canada-wide conversation, I mean, like there are two separate angles to that, right? The first is that not all of the Maple 8 are Ontario funds. A
Hmm.
few of them are OMERS, OTPP, Healthcare of Ontario, or Hospitals of Ontario. I can never remember the acronym. Uh, but the Canada Pension Plan, which we all pay into, assuming that we're, regular wage earners, is the National Public Pension Plan. It's not an employer-based plan. The CAS, which is the QPP, the Alberta Investment Management Company, BC Investments. Each province has its own major pension manager, and the bigger the province, the bigger the fund. And so it totally is it's far from just an Ontario story. I focus on OMERS and OTPP in the book because well, I focus on them for a couple reasons. One is simply that I was more interested in employer-based pensions
Hmm.
than the welfare state.
That's fair. Yeah.
So that's why I don't focus on CPP. It's why I don't focus on the CAS. It's why I'm focused on OMERS and OTPP. But the other is that the labor of the members themselves is very intimately tied up in the same processes that produce this sort of financialization dynamic.
Hmm.
And so like that's why I focus on the Ontario. It's funny, it was actually inconvenient at first because I was based out of Montreal when this started. I ended up back in Toronto, but I was
Right.
in
Yeah.
Montreal when this started, uh having
Sure.
to research Toronto and having to research Ontario. But you're totally correct. It is very much a national story.
Hmm. Yeah. What are the before we get back to like the more national and international part, I do want to mention at least one term or key term that you bring up in the book, which is the pension contradiction, which I think is good to kind of raise before we keep going in this conversation. And to put it very briefly, and feel free to expand on this, but the way I saw it was that it's this tension between pensions that are meant as welfare, right, or at least as a benefit to, in this case, the Ontario population, and pensions as capital, right? Capital investment, capital as global force, right? Capital as et cetera and so forth, right? Um, and I'm curious, right? Where you see this term kind of emerging, right, or where you see this force kind of emerging, and if there are any existing models that maybe mitigate this contradiction, right? And you do raise it a little bit in the book, but I do think it would be important to at least talk about it.
Yeah, so your your characterization of it is apt. The contradiction between pension as welfare and pension as capital. There's a long history in what can broadly be called critical pension studies.
Sure. Yeah.
Uh, but more broad, it's kind of like let's back up. Since the 1970s,
Hmm.
really since the first kind of realization that private sector pensions in the United States, think like, the big Teamsters pension that owns Las
Hmm.
Vegas, right?
Yeah.
Had become these enormously powerful forces in the US financial sector. There's this book that comes out 1976 by this scholar kind of consultant, this guy Peter Drucker, who is often referred to as a management guru,
Yeah. I've
one of
heard the
these
name before.
experts of the history of the US corporation. And he writes this book called The Unseen Revolution, in which he suggests that the US is the world's first socialist country. A deeply provocative claim, obviously. And his reason is that private sector pension funds now owned over half of US company stock. And so, if socialism is worker ownership, then the US has already done it. Obviously, he's trying to be a little cheeky with it,
Uh-huh.
but he's making a point about pretty dramatic changes in the shape of the U.S. financial sector. Shortly thereafter, in the shadows of kind of the early intense stages of U.S. deindustrialization, we're talking the late 70s. You've had the OPEC oil crisis in 73, stagflation through the subsequent 5 to 7 years, and like a serious sort of reckoning with what happens when Keynesianism stops working, what happens when, the industrial machine that had this everybody wins, the pie keeps getting bigger sort of mentality to it, what happens when suddenly capital is like totally pivoting
Unleashed.
elsewhere. And these two economists, I think labor movement affiliated, kind of adjacent, but they're not trade union economists at their core. These two guys, Jeremy Rifkin and Randy Barber, write this book called The North Will Rise Again, which is it's a political treatise, basically, in which they lay out a plan through which American pension funds can reindustrialize the Rust Belt. It is this vision of what worker ownership, community ownership in the US can look like with pension capital as kind of the root of it. So Rifkin and Barber and this Drucker book kind of set the ball rolling on an intellectual ecosystem in which labor economists, progressive economists, operating under the shadow of a weakening left, a weakening labor movement, factory closures. Like, it's not just that unions are getting busted, it's just also like factories are moving.
Yeah. Mhm.
Places are closing. Deunionization does not have to be decertification. Deunionization can be shut down.
Mhm.
And so, desperate for any for any branch they can grab onto to pull themselves out of the quicksand, economists at a few major American unions and at a couple Canadian think tanks, most notably the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, start looking towards the big pension fund as a potential pathway out. Because here they have all this capital, it's going into the same financial sector that is buying their factory, is closing it, et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea of the pension contradiction, because I know what the question initially was, the idea of the pension contradiction in its earliest sort of germ form is probably best articulated by the former president of the United Steelworkers, Leo Gerard, who in the foreword of one such tracked by progressive economists, wrote about the importance of preventing workers' throats from being cut with their own money. It's very, hefty. It's very emotional.
You got to be rhetorically smart for that one.
Exactly. It's a real soapbox scorcher.
Yeah.
So that is the easiest kind of way of articulating the pension contradiction as is. And the idea of the pension contradiction kind of carries through even into that literature that is very critical of this sort of tradition in progressive labor economics. And I think
Right.
specifically of a recent book, a very good book, recommended to people who maybe read this and want to get, potentially a bit more robust of an outlook. This book called The Contradictions of Pension Fund Capitalism, which came out probably 5 or 6 years ago. And again, they take on the idea, the contradiction is the inextricable tension between labor and capital. What happens when labor's savings become capital, start hitting labor? All of that is totally totally fair and a good foundation. What I hope to do in the book and how I conceptualize the pension contradiction, I aim to bring an additional level of specificity to it.
Okay.
Because if you take Leo Gerard's quote as is, and that conventional conceptualization of the pension contradiction, you are basically just one step down from there's no ethical consumption under capitalism.
Right. Exactly.
Which is in itself true, but probably gets us nowhere analytically.
Mm-hmm.
It's a paralyzing phrase, right?
Yes.
Like we're the second anything happened, it's all
Damned
oppression,
if you,
whatever.
yeah, it's a fancy way of saying damned if you do, damned if you. Yes.
Exactly. And it lacks the rigor
Hmm.
that it needs on a more detailed level when looking at robust political economy, right?
Right.
Because pensions were investing in equity in the 40s and the 50s, and it wasn't closing their factory,
Right.
and it wasn't privatizing their hospital. So clearly more things are going on here. And so the way I conceptualize the pension contradiction is deeply related to the change in the structure of North American and European political economy since the 1970s, wherein that process of factory closures, things like that are discussed at length in Rifkin and Barber and elsewhere in basically any economic telling of the last 50 years,
Yeah. Hmm.
gets supplanted by a mode of capital accumulation wherein profits are found in those parts of the world, those parts of the built environment, I should say, that the geographer and political scientist Heather Whiteside has very astutely called too socially integral to fail.
Yeah. That's a really good way of putting
The key tenet to bringing it all together is the shift from what can be called a productive form of capitalism, industrial capitalism, towards a post-industrial model of capital accumulation, in which profits are made through rising asset values and through rents. What the geographer Brett Christophers has very adeptly called rentier capitalism, what the economist Benjamin Braun calls asset manager capitalism. But what is also missing in those analyses, which I think is the crucial flip side of the pension contradiction, because that captures the pension as capital problem,
it.
but it
Hmm.
doesn't
Yeah.
get to the pension as welfare problem,
Exactly.
is the fact that there has been a corresponding shift in labor markets under this shift in profit making away from labor directly adding value in kind
Mhm.
of a classical sort of Ricardian
Yeah.
sense
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to labor basically keeping the lights on, as it were. Profit has no connection, or has a far more tenuous connection to labor now than it did 45 years ago.
Hmm.
More and more labor, and especially unionized labor, is found in what can be called the reproductive sectors of the economy. And by reproductive there, I'm referring in the sense of social reproduction
Yeah.
theory, which is a key kind of umbrella bringing this all together. And for any listeners who are unfamiliar, social reproduction theory, it's a tradition in Marxist feminism that looks at not just the worker producing, but the question of
Mhm.
how the worker themselves is produced. If labor power is commodity, what makes that commodity? And so it's largely interested in, the social processes of everyday life and how they relate to capitalist political.
Mhm.
And so the big kind of economic scaffolding of the whole thing is a shift in organized labor from productive to reproductive work and the relation of that to the same social infrastructures which are now the basis of capital accumulation in the absence of productive enterprise. Then you add to that, and this is the third rope entering this terrible Gordian knot, the fact that the point of a pension is to supplant wages in
Mhm.
retirement. And so if wages are meant to cover the reproduction of the worker in their working life, the pension is meant to cover their reproduction following, when
Mhm.
it goes from being the reproduction of labor power to just the reproduction of life itself. And so those same commodities, which are integral to the reproduction of the individual, especially in old age, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, housing, are also the last terrains left for capital to conquer. And in this era of financialization and the history of pension marketization the book goes into, it is the same entities which are meant to be paying for their welfare in old age are also commodifying the key pieces of their old age. And a lot of this commodification isn't new.
No.
Marx in Capital Volume 1 talks about primitive accumulation as the prerequisite for capitalism. But Marx conceptualizes primitive accumulation, at least in Volume 1, as an event. It is
Yeah.
a thing that occurs, it detaches the worker from self-subsistence, they go into the wage labor force.
It's part of the whole historical process, and so, yeah.
But in 20th and 21st century capitalism, we need to think about primitive accumulation, or what geographers have later conceptualized as accumulation by dispossession, as an ongoing cyclical process which is necessary for capitalism to dig itself out of crises. And so, how does capital respond to the crisis of industry in the 70s? It begins new rounds of accumulation by dispossession until eventually the entire foundation of our economy, and we're seeing this now with all the conversations around Canada having a productivity crisis, are new rounds of asset accumulation kind of driven by low interest rates. And it's entirely fictional. There's a reason why Marx calls it fictitious capital, which is something that the geographers took and ran with in very astute sort of ways. So that's the pension contradiction at its core. Is this tension between the labor in the reproductive sector of the members of the fund, the usage of these funds for those self-same processes of commodification of social infrastructure, and then finally, perhaps the key component, which is the utility of pension as a form of paying for the retirement of beneficiaries. And so the way that I put it in the introduction is that retirement itself encapsulates the contradiction itself. It's where it collides. Mm-hmm. You have the privatization of the goods needed to retire combined with the need for steady income to pay for those self-same goods in this terrible ongoing circle. And so whereas a lot of previous conversations about the pension contradiction have looked just kind of broadly at, the union pension fund is invested in Walmart, Walmart's anti-union. I think there's a need to look more carefully at the nature of 21st century labor, the nature of 21st century finance, and the relationship between the two. And that's where social reproduction really becomes this very vital kind of connective tissue, making the whole thing make sense.
Yeah. It's interesting hearing you talk, and you refer to the idea of there is no ethical consumption and so on. And one of the things that to bring it more to the stuff that I'm familiar with cultural theory, that people like Mark Fisher, for example, have brought up, is ran with the idea of there is no alternative. And hearing you speak about the way that capital has become imbricated with are the very services that we're living with, right? And that we need in the 21st century, or that a lot of people, it adds a level almost of despair to that point, because where do you go from there? How do you resist something like that when it's literally the thing that's, for many people, keeping you alive, or at least going to keep you alive after you stop working? And that leads me at least to my next question, which is, when we have a system, as you're describing, that's benefiting from pension funds, but also fighting against things or fighting for things, I should say, like housing justice, or fighting high inflation rates and so on, how can we possibly solve these contradictions? Is there a way to actually tangle these things, and not still keeping some kind of financial security future? Is there a way can be a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to it's hard to say if there really is a path out. One of the things that I try and consistently keep in mind at points implicitly, at points explicitly, is that the interest of workers in their pension having very good financial returns is an incredibly justified interest.
Yeah.
They have been hard fought for, and they are, in the absence of a more wide, robust social safety net, they're all we have. And that itself is its own point of contention for those who would like to destroy it. There's this whole conception of the public sector worker with the gold-plated pension. But they have been extremely, extremely hard fought for, and they're critical. I mean, a pension fund in itself is its own form of critical social infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, it is a social infrastructure that has come through a long history of the development of the welfare state that itself is racked with all sorts of contradiction. But in the immediate, you're not going to find many people who are going to be happy if you say, burn the pension funds to the ground. And nor should they be.
No, exactly.
And nor should they be.
No.
Unfortunately, and this is where we get into the question of what is actually possible.
Yeah.
Is that there's a deep urge and a very earnest urge that there's no bad faith about it. There's no cynicism trying to have it both ways at once about it. It just is what it is.
Hmm.
There's an urge to simultaneously want the pension fund to have the best return it can and be upset when the returns are bad, while also being hypercritical of the social consequences of the investment.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in a political economy where profits are made via the enclosure of necessities,
Hmm.
you cannot have those both ways. It's there's a fundamental tension at play there. And so I put it in the book at one point, although, the US right has made a major bugbear of what's called ESG investment, which the ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, which is this notion of kind of more ethical investment, kind of, and it grows out of that same history, Rifkin and Barber, that I was talking about earlier. It's become kind of a key component to labor, especially in the US, how they try and reckon with the pension contradiction is through these notions of social investment.
Hmm.
But at their core, or at its core, sorry, social investment is lipstick on a pig. You're using, hyper specific metrics to, send yourself in circles to try and pretend that one oil company is better than another.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, like,
It's the carbon footprint thing. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah. Mhm.
so, like, we should be broadly resistant to being pigeonholed into defending social investment. If the right
Mhm.
wants to call Disney woke capital, so be
Sure.
it. I
Whatever.
mean, like, that's it's the way it goes. It's not
It's
my
the world we
sacred.
live in. Yeah.
Yeah, like, we shouldn't treat ESG as a sacred cow to be defending.
Exactly. Mhm.
Um, but then that does beg the question, if not social investment, then what?
Right.
Because obviously there's a very real earnest interest in consistent rate of return. And obviously there's a very real earnest interest, especially for those unions which try and conceptualize themselves as bigger picture unions, labor
Mhm.
movement unions. They're not just interested in collective bargaining gains, they're interested in trying to drive a just society. If you're going with the two sides of the tension at play, eventually you have to recognize that they cannot be reconciled. And so you have to find, and I'll use this word with a little bit of tongue in cheek because you just referenced there is no alternative.
Mhm.
You have to find a third way with regards
Yeah. Mhm.
to the pension system. And
Yeah.
the closest I come to thinking what that could look like, and it's all very shallow. It's the part of the book I'm the least happy with, but simply because I could have spent the next 20 years trying to think of a satisfying answer to the what
Yeah.
is to be done question and not come
That'll
up
be
with
the next
it.
book. Yeah.
The best I can think of is that we need to push for a social system in which a pension is unnecessary.
Mm.
The only pathway out, given that capital accumulation is going to keep coming from evil things, specifically things related to social reproduction,
Hmm.
and people are going to keep getting older and are going to keep needing to survive into old
Yeah.
age. At least I hope
Mhm.
so. The only way to deal with that is to make the commodities necessary for the reproduction of the self, aka the necessities of survival,
Yep. Hmm.
detached from the market. And so, like, what's the pathway out of the pension contradiction? The pathway out of the pension contradiction is genuinely universal healthcare. The pathway out of the pension contradiction is mass build-outs of public housing. It's
Yeah.
pharmaceuticals. It's ensuring that a large pension isn't necessary.
Mm.
It gets kind of back to the whole core when, if you go back to the history of early socialism and the concept of the wage is still this kind of recent phenomenon that has not become totally
Yeah.
ingrained in the psyche and then by extension, then it just becomes hegemonic when the abolition of the wage form is still something that's active in the mind.
Hmm.
It's not, oh, well, we need to increase wages to meet increasing costs, etc. It's we need to get rid of wage labor entirely. Well, let's take that into
Exactly.
the 21st century. We need to get rid of the necessity for the pension.
Yeah.
Like that to me is really the only pathway out. Because
But
on the because if you have it in such a way where you heavily restrict what pension funds can and cannot invest in, you end up with lower rates of return. People are suffering, and there's other forms of finance capital that are going to enclose this. You do
exactly.
the flip side, whatever. Let's just make the returns as good as possible. And life is bad because finance capital privatize your bus system or whatever. Like truly the only pathway out is to cut the Gordian knot by removing the thing that causes the tension. And the thing that causes the tension is the commodification of necessity. And so that's kind of the only way out, unfortunately, which is deeply, it's deeply unsatisfying for the response to a political question to be build full socialism.
It's not entirely unsatisfying, but I do think we can like parse it out perhaps a little bit, because I do think it's worthwhile to think about, right? And you were bringing up, for example, early forms of anti-capitalism that addressed this critique that you're raising, right? And that's one of the questions I brought up, and you can maybe tangentially answer it of like, are there historical examples that came up in your research or that you're aware of that actually did demonstrate some kind of viable shift away? But I just want to hop on as well, if you want to think about that question while I say this, but it is also demonstrative, this idea of simply moving away from the current model, right, entirely. It is demonstrative of the way that, to use the terms that you brought up, capital reproduces itself, right? It's kind of made itself again, ingrained in these ways, that, as a lot of critics of neoliberalism would tell you, right, is pretending to be beneficial, but ultimately exists only to like eke out any sense or any last drop of labor from people, right? Whether it's their services or so on. So I don't entirely disagree with your idea that it may be a straightforward answer, but it's not entirely a wrong answer, I would say, to just actually move entirely away from it. I don't know if you want to pick up anything of what I just said, but I did think it was not a cop-out answer, to reassure you.
Yeah, I definitely didn't think the answer was wrong because
of course.
But with regards to like, have there been any endeavors and alternative?
Yeah.
There were some that have, and I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on these in any sort of meaningful way, but there are some that have kind of attempted to dabble here and attempted to dabble there with varying degrees of success. The one that mostly jumps to mind is in the province of Quebec. The FTQ, which is the main large trade union federation, or one of the two, operates a investment vehicle called the Fonds de Solidarité, which is the Solidarity Fund, which is it's kind of the platonic ideal of what's called workers' capital in this kind of social investment labor literature, where union pension savings are being invested, but with very kind of social conscious, no requirements surrounding rate of return, fiduciary duty, etc., which that's something we haven't even touched as an inhibiting force. And yet, and at least that's my understanding from what other people have written about it, because I'm not an expert on the Solidarity Fund in any meaningful way.
Sure.
But my understanding is that the Solidarity Fund basically operates like a regular pension fund, with the one exception that it is very attuned to what can kind of be called like a modernist economic nationalism, not dissimilar to like kind of the classic Parti Québécois social democrat strategy.
That's not entirely wrong.
And there is a strong linkage between those sorts of pension fund investment strategies and the tradition of economic nationalism. And a lot of it comes down to this the lionization and reification of the notion of job creation, which we're going to create good jobs in Canada with Canadian money, or we're going to create good jobs in Quebec with Québécois money, which we're now seeing kind of a new round of that in Ontario. The Ford government has specifically highlighted Ontario pension funds as this major potential source of capital, but it has a long prehistory in Ontario's response to deindustrialization, which the labor movement begins to look towards the pension funds as these potential instrument of job creation. But again, like there's no grand plan for social transformation at play here. It's just it's just job creation.
Yeah.
The real example that I think presents something that can be worked with is the experiments in social welfare undertaken by American trade union in the 20 years leading up to the New Deal,
Mm.
Those which, as far as, further reading recommendations are very adeptly discussed in Gail Radford's Modern Housing for America and Elizabeth Cohen's Making a New Deal, in which, in the total absence of anything resembling a welfare state, and with the limited reach of welfare capitalism at that point, which is, employer-based benefits, those sorts of things that really integrate the labor movement into capital. Uh, Large unions in major American cities, notably Chicago and New York, undertook really kind of radical experiments in decommodified labor community-driven social reproduction. So the example I like to always use, and I use it in the book a little bit, is the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America's cooperative housing on the Lower East Side of New York.
Yeah.
In the 1930s, a strong union that was heavily integrated in the local Jewish community, which was a heavily socialist Jewish community, having largely fled Russia in 1905, not
Hmm.
1917,
Yeah,
1905,
yeah.
and had basically turned the Lower East Side into like a red enclave,
Hmm.
most of whom were working in the garment factories in that part of town. And the union began building cooperative housing for the union's members, which had childcare institutions, which had libraries. And the idea undergirding it, and I'll use the President Sidney Hillman's words here because they're better than mine. At an amalgamated convention in 1931, Hillman said that the idea behind those buildings were to show the government that labor has the power to build good housing. It's a fact, not a theory.
Right.
And the question then is, when we're thinking about union-driven decommodification as premise,
Hmm.
there's the question of scale, I think, first and foremost, right? The amalgamated never intended to be large-scale housing developers. The point that they
Hmm.
were making was to look at FDR right in the face and say, we can do it, why can't you?
Yeah.
It was just as much a statement of power and a statement of principle as anything else. And so when you get into the question of scale, there are obvious limitations, largely rooted in the basic tension between being a union and being a landlord. And
Of course.
we've seen that with the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust, as well as examples in Canada. For instance, the Laborers International Union of North America, LIUNA, owns a couple apartment buildings, which I would not recommend looking at the Google reviews of. So there were limitations to such a strategy, but I think there's the kernel is there of a
Hmm.
labor-driven alternative to capitalist welfare
Yeah.
and the welfare state.
Hmm.
Because one of the key things here that I consistently try to emphasize in the book is that while marketization, which occurred in the 1980s,
Hmm.
made Ontario pension funds enormous evil mega behemoths, things were not rosy before that. The pension funds were not sustainable prior to that. They are now, they were not prior to that. Their investments were entirely in government bonds, which hypothetically means that they are supporting the building of a government welfare state because
Yep.
they're giving the government the fiscal capital it needs, which, in the case, teachers alone owned a quarter of Ontario government debt in the 1980s. Like they were major funders
Yep.
of the Ontario modernist state. And Ontario was no welfare state paradise through the
Of course
60s
not.
and through the 70s. Unless you have very meaningful kind of deep democracy, which we're talking the day after the Ontario election, so I'm not sure we
Exactly.
can really say that. Um, it's not enough to just simply say, okay, well, like, what if we get the pension funds to start doing stuff with the state, and then we have,
Hmm.
robust welfare? That's not good for the pension funds, and it doesn't really create good social welfare. So, like, I think it's worth looking to the example of those 20s and 30s movements, cognizant of the limitations and cognizant of the problems which subsequent endeavors to capture that spirit have had. And does that mean that, they need to be driven more as cooperatives? Does that require like a far deeper sort of democratization? Like probably. Yeah, I would
Sure.
imagine so. But the bigger, I think, kind of political question underlying that in terms of, okay, well, is it through the pension funds that they do this? is that pension funds, to use the metaphor Quinn Slobodian really effectively uses to describe neoliberalism, pension funds are encased from democracy.
Right.
So Slobodian in his amazing history of neoliberalism, Globalists, refers to the neoliberal project as at its core being to make markets safe from democracy. And he uses this metaphor of encasement, which is the production of labyrinthine networks of law
Yeah.
and of obligation. And pension funds are a perfect example of such a thing. Despite the fact that there is an ostensible democracy in
Mhm.
major pension funds, which are by and large jointly trusteed, which means that they're
Mhm.
half employer, which in this case is different segments of the state, and they're half union, there are intense legal requirements on all trustees, employer and
Mhm.
union alike, to
Right.
be singularly dedicated to what is called fiduciary duty. What fiduciary duty means is that the money in a pension fund is technically being held in trust for the members, and the obligation of the trustees is to ensure it is well taken care of and invested accurately, lest they run into like literally like problems of legal liability.
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
as we speak, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan is being sued by members because they made a really dumb crypto investment. So, there is a very real legal architecture that does, to a pretty large degree, prevent kind of meaningful democratic control of a pension fund.
Yeah.
There are also requirements as to who can be a trustee, like even a union trustee, in terms of kind of expertise on finance and actuarial issues and things like that. Then you add to the fact that a bunch of these plans, there's conflict between the unions who are trusteeing. Then you add to the fact that by and large, like if you're a trustee on one of these funds, you are singularly, and I think justifiably, getting back to our conversation earlier, you're totally only thinking about uh the rate of return. You're not thinking in terms of grand social experimentation,
Of course not.
which nor should you be. And so like that's where we really run into the limitations of like the pensions as the strategy, because it really would have to be heavily coordinated and driven by an insanely robust democratization process, like a rank and file push within all these unions. It is not the sort of thing that could be done standalone by union bureaucrats, union
Yeah.
staffers. It is in or if it were to work, it would have to be by necessity fully driven by rank and file with full rank and file buy-in. And so you know, is there a possibility? I don't think it's totally outside of the realm of
Yeah.
political possibility, right?
But it's
But
it is interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but the I I just thought of what you were saying here, and the comes back also. It's not impossible, like you're saying, to give this power back to the rank and file, but it does come back again to the fact of labor being the driving force behind capital, right? To the services themselves, right? This kind of abstraction that's happened, I think, is kind of demonstrative of what you're talking about. Abstraction in the literal sense of the term. But one of the other things that you brought up, and I know we're coming up on the hour here, which is, you've talked about other stuff that I had questions about, so I'm comfortable kind of jumping into this question here. But one of the things that you brought up was questions of scale, and one of the things that you also mentioned in your book is how this is an international problem, right? At the end, or an international, yeah, I guess problem or issue at the end of the day, right? Pension funds have investments across the world. And I'm curious, right, how you see more localized kind of labor leveraging or labor power, right, having any kind of effect or any kind of relation to more international labor, international, right? That was one of the questions I had, but I wanted to give you time at least to talk about that a little bit before we got too far out.
yeah, like it's the sort of thing that the pension fund investments have not really come up
Mhm.
in what I'll broadly call sweepingly Canadian left internationalism, which obviously Canada has a very deep, robust, and meaningful history of internationalist solidarity. And a lot of the focus when when those movements are not simply solidarity movements, but when those movements are specifically about Canadian capital, all the focus, I will go so far as to say all of the focus, 99% of the focus is on mining,
Right.
which is, again, a totally understandable thing.
Yep. Got to get your money from somewhere.
And when there's the pension fund angle, I think adds another wrinkle to Canada's role in global capitalism. The mining is a very direct form of extraction. It's a very literal form of extraction. It's a very physical form of extraction. One of the points I try and make in the book is that Canadian pension funds operate in the global south through another sort of extractivism. They operate by a similarly extractive logic. They just do it through the extraction of value rather than the extraction, which has its own socially corrosive, enclosing dynamic, not dissimilar to that experience. And so, if we're thinking critically about Canada's role in global capitalism, I see a privatized hospital in Mumbai similarly as I see a strip mine in Mali. Like that's kind of it's all part of
Hmm.
the same tissue. But I think it's extremely important that we start integrating the pension fund analysis into how we think about Canadian left internationalism, precisely because of our own personal financial investment in it. I don't own stock in Barrick Gold, but I contribute to the Canada Pension Plan.
Yeah, exactly. Hmm.
And so if labor solidarity committees or people who are members of trade unions but are also participating in local solidarity movements are thinking about these things, I think it's extremely important that we start really thinking about Canadian finance, not
Hmm.
just Canadian extraction, as part of Canadian capitalism's relationship to the global south. You know,
Hmm.
it's this funny thing. I quote Kwame Nkrumah at length at one point in the book, Nkrumah being the first prime minister of the independent Ghana.
Yep.
And he wrote in his classic Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, this beautiful long page basically explaining the mechanics through which the imperial welfare state was formed through colonial wealth extraction.
Hmm.
And the funny thing is, in the age of neoliberalism, we've cut out every middleman in that process.
Exactly.
The old colonial welfare state, wealth was extracted from the colony, was taxed in the metropole, was then redistributed through the welfare state. Now the welfare fund is literally just going and taking it itself.
Yeah.
No intermediaries required, no state, no taxation, no nothing. Cutting right to the
Hmm.
chase. It's very efficient. And so like if the aim for people on the Canadian left, as it should be, is to be supporting workers' struggles and movements across the global south. I think it's really integral to think about how the structure of our welfare state or our welfare not state,
Hmm.
when it's a private pension, uh, has its own sort of, we'll call like a segmenting impact.
Yeah.
Like our position in the global hierarchy of labor is laid by our welfare state in relation to the social infrastructure necessity in the global south. A Canadian worker's place in global capitalism is partially informed by the privatization of electricity utilities in Chile. And that to me has so far been a very undertold element of the story of Canadian left internationalism. And I think it really does need to be foregrounded. It was striking to me, this would have been probably 18 months ago, when there were kind of the first bursts of a serious conflict between the federal government and the government of Narendra Modi in India,
Yeah.
that even while all this is happening, where Modi has made such a thing of being the bulwark against China, we're pivoting from China, we're pivoting to India.
Yep.
But Modi is also committed to a deeply fascist domestic agenda, which directly contradicts with its attempt to position within global capitalism. Because in order for Modi to do domestic fascism, he has to be assassinating Sikhs in British Columbia.
Right.
Uh, Even within all of that, the Canadian pension funds did not blink on India. Teachers only just opened its Mumbai office, 2022. CPP opened a Mumbai office, I believe it was 2019. Contrast that to their respective attitudes towards China in the last couple of years, and it's really quite striking. So if people on the Canadian left are trying to expressed solidarity with anti-Hindutva movements in India, anti-fascist movements in Brazil, because CPP was super imbricated in privatization strategies of the Bolsonaro government through the tail end of the 2010s. We need to be actively putting our pension funds in the spotlight. And there have been bursts of that.
Mhm.
Press releases were put out about CPP.
There's like slight de-investment plans or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But, it hasn't been it's not a fulsome part of the critique, and it's not a fulsome part of the messaging. Yeah, and so, the global element of this was something that grew more and more as the writing of the book went on.
Yeah,
Because it became clear to me as I was writing that it's a huge part of the story. And it's an underexplored part of the story. What interests me partially about it is that the economic processes at play are actually very similar to those which are occurring here. Despite this notion that, oh well, production is moving from here to the global south, a bunch of these countries are themselves deindustrializing or deindustrialized
yeah,
and are finding pathways to capital accumulation in the same way as we are, through the extraction of value from the built environment. It's fictitious capital the whole way down. You can't just cleanly divide, this is the world where it's fictitious capital, this is the world where they make stuff.
exactly.
And so, like, if a huge part of the premise of, the rise of India is these enormous infrastructure build outs, um, obviously, private capital is going to be totally licking its lips, similar to what they would be doing if we were doing a similar giant infrastructure build out here. And so, if no, I'm going to end the thought there. I don't know where that's at.
No, no, but it's interesting because you brought up the political element and the labor relations and internationalism. You can even add, of course, it was implicit in your answer, but the environmental component as well, right? Which is integral to the way that the system functions, right? Is extracting resources directly from the planet, which again is something that there has been some resistance to in some way, shape, or form, right? Through various protests and all of that. But again, it's so imbricated that, I would encourage people to push that even further, right? Push that critique even further, push that action even further, because it does go deeper. It goes literally into impacting your wallet, in this case, your future wallet. So, and no, I full-heartedly agree with what you were saying and add the environmental component or emphasize the environmental component as well, right? Which you do bring up a little bit in the book as well, but I just want to re-emphasize that. Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add on to that, but I just wanted to like mention
Well,
that.
yeah, just so, like the climate angle is super interesting when it
Mhm.
gets wrapped up in the question of infrastructure ownership and kind of the private infrastructure economy.
Exactly.
Because obviously the infrastructure build outs necessary
Mhm.
for transition are are totally enormous. Absolutely enormous. And obviously, like we're seeing parts of it ripped up since Trump came into office, but like Biden's Inflation Reduction Act really kind of put a shot in the arm for renewable infrastructure in the United States, which then had corresponding impacts in Canada.
Yes.
And it's obviously part of, a broader global, we need to be electrifying the shit out of everything right now, which obviously China has been doing quite a bit more rapidly than other countries,
Mhm.
um, maybe in part because it's not private capital doing it. It's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, of course.
But one of the interesting things is that a lot of pension funds are looking at the just transition as like an enormous cash event. And if we have a more robust pension analysis than the simple kind of social investment lens, then we still see problematics in that. A simple social investment lens looks at, oh, well, let's invest in this enormous kind of wind energy project. Oh, it'll have good returns and it'll have, good environmental impacts. But it's a privatized electricity grid, which will have a natural monopoly, no democratic control over rates, no nothing, beholden to market forces. And so, like, we're already beginning to see the financial sector attempt to prevent mass climate catastrophe with a mass privatization frenzy, which I think we should just be generally resistant to. as opposed to taking on the notion of, oh, it can be good for our pensions and it can be good for the planet. We need to maybe think a little bit more critically about infrastructure privatization. And that's something
Which is
that I've been so far, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, that a lot of the conversations in pension land have been broadly, I'm not going to say uniformly, but broadly discouraging in that regard. Again,
yeah,
there's a ton of nuances to that, and
of course.
I talk about it in more detail in the book because like I'm not of the opinion that pension green investments are a green herring. Like
Yeah,
there is definitely some good stuff going on there, but it gives me pause when a Canadian pension fund's privatization of a wind utility in Chile is seen as being a very exciting sort of thing. Most of the green infrastructure build outs that are occurring in purely private fashion are happening in countries that do not have extremely robust public infrastructure systems, and most of those countries are in the global south.
exactly. And they can happen here because we brutally exploit the environment elsewhere. Or, yes, it is good. I would add to that by saying, but again, it's not enough. Like you can push that further. Where I
Mhm.
buck up against this type of discourse is when people claim it as the last step or any kind of
Yeah.
like end all be all solution, which, I'm generally against, but I do support your idea of saying, well, no, it is not inherently a bad thing, right? Like, yes, greenwashing can be a thing, but it's not necessarily always the case. Yeah, that's true. Um, so, like I said, you, through your very eloquent answers, kind of answered other questions that I had here and there. And I don't want to take up too much of your time, of course, but I always like to finish off, or towards the end of my interviews, I always like to ask people if there's anything in particular that they want to highlight, either about any of their ideas throughout the interview or their book in particular, right? Before we actually leave off, right? Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to actually highlight, or anything that you wanted to expand upon?
I don't think so in particular, other than to say
Mhm.
that the Canadian pension system should inspire us all to think about how our own surroundings in everyday life are totally enmeshed in the big picture political economic movements that structure the world in which we live. No element of our lives is untouched by finance capital in an era in which those elements of our lives are where accumulation comes from. We are in the age of deindustrial capitalism, and deindustrial capitalism finds its accumulation in necessity. It does not find it in the making of stuff, it finds it in the taking of value from the stuff that keeps you alive. So just keep that in mind as you're going through the world, because we are all enmeshed in these horrifying networks, and the only way to get us out of these horrifying networks is for us to stand with each other as opposed to individual kind of little atoms in a horrifying financial molecule. Yeah, that would be kind of
Okay.
the overarching gist. That's what I'd like people to
To take away.
to take away.
Yeah, wonderful. So I highly encourage people to actually buy the book. We only talked about some of the elements of it, right? Invested in Crisis. It's already out. I think it was released a few weeks ago at this point, at the time of recording.
Yeah, earlier this week, I think.
Oh, okay. Actually, sooner than I expected. Yeah, check it out. It's Between the Lines Publishing. And yeah, is there anywhere that you'd like people to reach out if they have questions or anything like that?
Um, I guess you'd probably send them to the publisher because I'm totally
Off the grid.
I'm off every grid. I deleted Twitter before it was cool.
Good.
I deactivated Twitter in 2021.
Nice. When
long
it was still
long
Twitter.
long before long before any Tesla. I've been long gone. So yeah, there isn't really an easy place to reach me. So if you have questions for me, I guess send them to the publisher or find my home address.
An easy thing to do, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Thank you very much, Tom, for your time. This was really interesting to listen to, and definitely a book that I recommend people pick up anywhere they can. It's really awesome.
Hey, thanks a lot, Patrick. Super happy to be here.